Before the Spaniards ever set foot in Tenochtitlan, the Mexica had already done something that should stop you cold. They turned off every fire in their empire. Not to mourn, not to pray, but because they believed the universe might literally end that night and only blood could restart it. Now here's the question that changes everything. Were they worshipping death? Were desperately keeping the world alive while Europe was still burning people in public squares? What if the story you think you know about Aztec sacrifice was never about savagery at all, but about who gets to decide whose violence counts as civilization? I'm Arturo, and this is Latin Lorda. From Latin America's history to mysteries and true crime, to local legends, whispering Latin intrigue, every tale is verified in archives before it reaches your headphones. Hit subscribe, fresh revelations drop every week, ready for your next campfire debate. In 1519, strangers climb a staircase that seems to rise out of the lake itself. Stone steps, steep as a vow, incense thick in the air, copal curling like breath, drums below, then the city noise, then when they reach the summit, the sudden hush that follows any act meant to be witnessed. The men from Castile will later say that what they found there should not exist in a civilized place. Dark stains that looked too fresh, offerings that looked too human, and the sense that the temple was not merely a building but a mouth. In their letters and memoirs, you can feel the moment harden into a verdict. They think they have discovered a monster, but what if they discovered a mirror and decided to call it a demon? Because you have to understand what they were standing on. This was not a jungle ruin swallowed by vines. This was Tenochtitlan, an engineered metropolis set on the waters of Lake Texcoco, laced with canals and causeways, guarded by dikes, fed by aqueducts, and supplied by markets whose order shocked even its enemies. Estimates of its population at the moment of contact vary, because counting a city built in reeds and stone through the smoke of conquest is never clean, but serious scholarship has long treated it as one of the largest urban centers on Earth in the early 16th century, plausibly in the hundreds of thousands. The point is not a single number, the point is scale. A city this dense does not survive on chaos, it survives on systems, agriculture, tribute, law, ritual, and the discipline of time. And time in the Mexica world was never a neutral backdrop. Time was an altar with teeth. So if the Spaniards reached the top of the temple and felt they had entered the territory of something inhuman, we have to ask a harder question than the one they offered. Not were the Mexica violent? All empires are violent. That is not a revelation. The real question is this: what did violence mean inside a cosmology where life and death were not opposites, but a continuous exchange, a circulation like water through canals, like maize through markets, like blood through the body of the sun? The first trap in this conversation is the archive itself. We do not inherit the Mexica world like a complete codex laid open on a table. We inherit fragments, painted manuscripts that survived fire and censorship, stone and bone recovered from beneath a colonial capital, and above all, Spanish descriptions that were written with motives as sharp as any obsidian blade. Some Spaniards wrote as soldiers who needed justification. Some wrote as missionaries who needed funding, permission, urgency, proof that idolatry was not merely error, but diabolical emergency. And long after the conquest, when the rituals they described had been criminalized, interrogations and recollections were filtered through fear, translation, and the new reality that every memory was now being judged by a foreign god. This is why the subject keeps moving. You think you've pinned it down, and it slips sideways, because even the witnesses do not agree with one another. One Spaniard insists he saw bodies torn open that same day. Another reports different numbers, different victims, different timing. One claims sacrifice happened everywhere, constantly. Another claims it stopped completely once the conquerors arrived, as if a centuries-old ritual economy could be switched off like a lamp. Some accounts obsess over cannibalism, market stalls supposedly selling human meat as casually as turkey, yet the very same accounts admit uncertainty. Rumor, we were told it seemed, we believed. The contradictions do not erase sacrifice. They warn you that what you're reading is not a neutral window, it's a weaponized lens. And the most dangerous part of a weaponized lens is that it can show you something real and still turn it into a lie. Because human sacrifice in central Mexico was real. It existed. It was practiced in different forms across Mesoamerica long before the Mexica rose to imperial dominance. And it is supported not only by texts, but by archaeology, human remains in offering caches, cut marks consistent with ritual killing in certain contexts, and the recovered architecture of skull displays near the sacred precinct. The evidence is not a Hollywood hallucination, but the meaning of that evidence is where the battle begins. The conquest did not simply destroy temples, it fought for its own interpretation. It fought to define what the Mexica were so that Spain could define what Spain was doing to them. And once you see that, the story changes. The monster is no longer the Aztec. The monster is the story that makes the empire feel like salvation. To enter the Mexica frame, you start not with the knife, but with the debt. There is a way modern people speak about belief as if it is decoration, private thoughts floating above real life. For the Mexica, belief was infrastructure. It explained why maize rises, why rains fail, why earthquakes swallow houses, why children die, why war arrives, and why the sun returns after darkness. It was not an escape from reality. It was their map of reality's demands. In the Nahua world, the cosmos was not born stable. It was born wounded. The earth itself was not a gentle mother drifting in the void. She was a vast force with hunger, a being carved and torn into a habitable surface, a ground that receives bodies and gives crops, that swallows and returns, that eats and is eaten. This is not poetry for effect. It is theology with consequences. If the world is made from sacrifice, divine bodies, divine blood, then sacrifice is not an invention of cruelty. It is the original condition of existence. This is where the story of the five sons enters like thunder, not as a cute myth to tell children, but as an explanation for why time feels like a countdown. The Mexica inherited and refined a sacred history in which worlds had already ended. 4 times the sun had failed, 4 times creation collapsed into catastrophe, flood, wind, fire, jaguars, the details shifting across traditions like a chant with variants, but the central truth remaining: the universe is breakable. We live under the 5th sun, the current era, often named Nahui Olan, 4 movement not as freedom, but as the trembling sign that one day the earth will shake itself apart again. The cosmos is cyclical. Creation is not a one-time miracle, it is an ongoing labor. And the most famous telling of that labor is anchored in Teotihuacan, the city the Mexica revered as a sacred predecessor, a place so ancient to them that it belonged to an age when God still walked openly. There, when darkness covered the world and a new sun had to be born, the gods gathered before a fire. 2 volunteered, a proud one adorned in wealth, and a humble one marked by sores and ash. The proud one hesitated at the flame's edge. The humble one stepped into the fire without delay and rose as the sun. The proud one followed, becoming the moon, bright, yes, but diminished, his face darkened by a thrown rabbit, in some versions of the tale, a mark of his failure. Listen to what that teaches. It teaches that the cosmos is sustained by courage, by voluntary offering, by the willingness to be consumed so others can live. It teaches that the gods themselves paid first. And if the gods paid first, then human beings made possible by that divine expenditure live in a state of obligation, not guilt, debt, reciprocity, a covenant. This is why the language of feeding is everywhere in Mesoamerican religion. To feed is not to demean, it is to participate in the exchange that keeps all levels of reality moving. Humans consume maize and beans and squash, the earth consumes bodies, the sun consumes heat and light, the gods consume offerings not because they are cartoon vampires, but because consumption is how life circulates. Even today, in many indigenous communities across Mexico and Central America, you can hear the echo of this logic in ceremonies that speak of paying the earth, of giving back, of not taking without offering. Continuity did not die in 1521. It adapted, it hid, it transformed, and it survived. Now place that cosmic debt inside the very specific material reality of Tenochtitlan, and sacrifice stops being an isolated horror scene and becomes part of a larger system. This city was built on a lake. It could not rely on endless pasture land or European-style grain fields. It relied on one of the most sophisticated agricultural inventions in the ancient world, chinampas, raised fields constructed in shallow lake beds and wetlands, anchored with trees, layered with mud and vegetation until they formed fertile rectangles laced by canals. Chinampas were not floating gardens in the childish sense. They were engineered ecological machines. They produced multiple harvests a year. They fed a dense city with maize, beans, squash, amaranth, chilies, tomatoes, herbs, and flowers. They turned water into bread. But chinampas also demand constant labor, dredging canals, maintaining dikes, coordinating water levels, and mobilizing communities. Agriculture here is not simply farming, it is civilization as choreography. It is the management of cycles, rainfall, planting, harvesting, storage, market distribution, and tribute flows. If maize fails, the city trembles. If water turns brackish, the city sickens. If the dikes break, the city floods. Survival is a ritual of maintenance. So when the Mexica looked at the sun and saw not a distant ball of fire, but a being engaged in daily struggle, when they believed that its movement could falter, that darkness could win, this was not abstract paranoia, it was a cosmology that matched their lived experience. Everything can fail if the system breaks. That is the foundation on which sacrifice stands, not as random brutality, but as cosmological maintenance, an extreme payment in a world where stability was never guaranteed. Now we can talk about the state. The Mexica Empire was not merely a spiritual community. It was a political machine built on alliances, tribute, intimidation, and ideology. By the early 16th century, Tenochtitlan stood at the center of a triple alliance with Texcoco and Tlacopan, an arrangement that allowed expansion across central Mexico through war and diplomacy. Conquered provinces paid tribute: cotton, cacao, feathers, jaguar skins, obsidian, salt, maize, labor, and crafted goods, feeding the capital's appetite and funding its rituals. Tribute was economics, yes, but also theology. The sacred precinct was not separate from state power, it was its beating heart. And at the center of that heart stood the Teletani, the one who speaks. The ruler was not a king in the modern secular sense. He was a mediator, a living hinge between human society and the divine forces that sustained it. His legitimacy was not only military success or noble blood, it was ritual competence. He had obligations that were political precisely because they were cosmic. If rains failed, if famine spread, if omens multiplied, it was not merely bad luck. It could be interpreted as ritual failure, a debt unpaid, an order disrupted. This is why Moctezuma II, Matacuzoma Xocoyotzin, the last fully independent ruler of Tenochtitlan before its fall, cannot be understood as a man who simply believed weird things. He inherited a throne that demanded constant ceremonial labor. He lived in a world where omens were not superstitions but information, messages embedded in the behavior of animals, in comets, in droughts, in dreams, in the strange coincidences that signal a shift in the cosmic balance. Whether he personally feared Cortés as a returning god, whether that was later Spanish embellishment, or whether he saw the Spaniards as dangerous political actors to be managed, what is certain is that his job required him to read time itself and respond with ritual. That ritual response was not improvised by amateurs, it was managed by a priesthood that functioned as an institution, trained, hierarchical, and specialized. In the sacred precinct of Tenochtitlan, the Templo Mayor rose as a double temple, one side dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, patron of the Mexica and embodiment of solar warfare, the other to Tlaloc, lord of rain and agricultural fertility. This architecture was theology made of stone, war and rain, captives and crops, expansion and sustenance. The state was literally built on a dual obligation: feed the sun that makes victory possible, and feed the rain that makes life possible. Priests were not a single type of figure in a single type of robe. There were ranks, offices, and disciplines. Young nobles often trained in the Kalmyk schools where ritual knowledge, calendric, speech, song, and ascetic discipline were drilled into the body. Priests fasted, performed nightly vigils, kept the temple fires, memorized festival sequences, mastered chants, and practiced auto-sacrifice, bloodletting from ears, tongues, thighs, and genitals, because the first offering expected from a ritual specialist was not the blood of others, but one's own. There were high priests associated with the major temple cults, and there were specialist sacrificers, singers, dancers, incense bearers, keepers of sacred bundles, diviners who read the 260-day tonal pohuali, and officials who coordinated the ritual calendar's demands across the city. This matters because it dismantles the cheap caricature of crazy priests. What you have instead is ritual bureaucracy, a complex schedule tied to two interlocking calendars, executed by trained specialists, reinforced by law and social expectation, and embedded in the life of the city. The Mexica kept a 365-day solar calendar, the Siopohuali, divided into 18 months of 20 days plus 5 dangerous liminal days, Nemontemi, when the world felt thin and unlucky, when people moved carefully, as if stepping around cracks in the sky. Alongside it ran the Tonal Pohuali, a 260-day sacred almanac that named days with numbers and signs, used for divination, naming, destiny, and ritual timing. These calendars meshed like gears, and every 52 solar years they realigned. That alignment was not a mere anniversary, it was a cosmic checkpoint, a moment when the world might end. Imagine what it means for a civilization to live with that rhythm, 52-year cycles of dread and renewal. Imagine what it means to extinguish every fire in a metropolis and wait in darkness for proof that time will continue. This was the new fire ceremony, performed on a hill outside the city. when priests watched the sky for the moment the stars signaled continuation. The accounts describe a sacrificial victim whose chest becomes the cradle of the new flame, the fire lit and then carried outward like a sacred artery, relighting temples and homes across the empire. Whether every detail is literal or partly symbolic in the telling, the meaning is clear. The fire that warms your family is not just a tool, it is a cosmic permission slip. Renewal is purchased. Now, with all of this in place, we can finally look at the act that outsiders fixate on and see it without turning it into pornography of violence. A typical state sacrifice in Tenochtitlan was not a chaotic murder, it was a ritual sequence. The victim, often a war captive, sometimes a slave, sometimes a condemned criminal, and in certain festivals, children associated with rain deities, was prepared. Preparation could involve fasting, bathing, adornment, and crucially, role transformation. In some rites, the victim was treated as an offering, in others as an ixipla, an image or embodiment of a deity. This is not a metaphor, it is a social and ritual reality. The person is dressed, painted, instructed, and addressed as the god. People might speak petitions to them, not because they believed the human being was secretly divine by nature, but because the ritual had made them a vessel. The god was being invited into the human world through the disciplined theater of embodiment. The day of sacrifice processions moved through the city. Drums, the huehuetl and teponaztli, spoke a language older than Spanish ears. Conch shells, whistles, chants, the smell of copal, flowers carried like prayers in the hand. On festival days, the city itself became an instrument. Streets were not just streets, they were corridors of ritual movement. The crowd was not just an audience, it was a participant body, witnessing the payment of the debt. Then came the ascent. The pyramid staircase matters because it is not merely a practical route to a platform, it is cosmology. To climb is to approach the sky, to move from the human market world into the divine precinct where gods receive offerings. The height magnified visibility. The act had to be seen, not for sadism, but for legitimacy. Public ritual teaches reality. It tells the city, the covenant is being maintained, the center is functioning, the sun will keep moving. At the summit, priests perform the killing with specific roles. Accounts describe multiple attendants holding the victim, a principal sacrificer using an obsidian or flint blade, materials that slice with a sharpness born of volcanic glass, and the offering of the heart and blood to the deity. Even when the descriptions become graphic, the core symbolism is consistent. The heart is not treated as mere meat, it is treated as the seat of vital force, the concentrated essence of life. Blood is not treated as gore, it is treated as precious water, the fluid that carries heat, movement, and spirit. And here we have to be precise. Life force in Nahua thought was not a single thing. There were multiple animating components, heat and destiny associated with the head, heart, soul associated with the chest, breath and wind associated with the liver and lungs. In different strands of thought, the body was not a machine but a sacred geography. To remove a heart in ritual is to extract the concentrated symbol of life and return it to the powers that made life possible. The act says, in its own language, we give back what we have been given, because nothing in this world is free. Afterward, the body might be cast down the steps, not as casual disrespect, but as a continuation of the offering logic. The earth receives what the sky has been given. Some victims' remains were treated in ways that modern audiences find unbearable, including the display of skulls on racks, and in some contexts, the distribution of flesh for ritual consumption by elites. The keyword here is context. Cannibalism in Mexican society is one of the most contested topics in the scholarship because Spanish accounts magnified it into a defining obsession, while archaeological and ethno-historical evidence suggests that if ritual consumption occurred, it was limited, highly structured, and bound to specific meanings rather than a dietary norm. The fantasy of marketplace cannibalism functions too perfectly as colonial propaganda to be accepted without skepticism. It is the kind of claim that turns conquest into a crusade. At the same time, it is historically illiterate to insist that no consumption ever occurred simply because it offends modern sensibilities. The sober position is this: there is evidence for post-mortem processing and, in some contexts, consumption, but the sensational image of a society feeding itself through human flesh is not supported as a general reality. The Mexica had abundant animal protein options, such as turkey, dogs raised for food in some regions, fish, insects, waterfowl, deer, and rabbits, alongside the dense nutrition of beans and maize. Sacrifice was not a butcher shop economy, it was a ritual economy. Now look again at the Sampantli, the skull displays that haunted Spanish imagination and still dominates popular images. Yes, Skull racks were real. They existed across Mesoamerica. In Tenochtitlan near the Templo Mayor, archaeology has revealed the remains of monumental skull displays, including structures consistent with towers built from mortared skulls. This does not confirm every colonial number. Some early accounts throw out figures so massive they strain plausibility, but it does confirm that death was displayed publicly and architecturally. Why? Because in the Mexica frame, death is not merely loss. Death is power. Death is a resource that must be handled correctly. The skull is not simply a trophy. It can be a relic, a warning, a proof of payment, an offering to the earth, a sign that the state can take life and therefore can protect life. One colonial commentary even compares such displays to Christian relics, unwittingly revealing the uncomfortable similarity. Both worlds knew how to make bones speak, and bones did speak. They spoke the language of war. Warfare in the Mexica world was not identical to warfare in the modern imagination, and certainly not identical to the annihilating logic that European empires often brought. Mexica warfare served multiple purposes: punishing rebellion, securing tribute, expanding influence, demonstrating legitimacy, and yes, acquiring captives. Captive taking mattered. Social mobility for warriors depended on taking enemies alive. The status of a man could rise through the number and quality of captives he brought to the state. This incentivized tactics that aimed to disable and capture rather than simply slaughter from afar. The famous macoahuatel, a wooden club edged with obsidian blades, could kill, but it could also maim. Ropes, coordinated formations, and the ritual framing of battle all supported the capture economy. Within that broader pattern sits the phenomenon often called the flower wars, soquillo-yore, ritualized conflicts remembered especially in relation to Tlaxcala and other neighbors. These wars appear in some interpretations as arranged battles that serve to train warriors, display courage, and acquire captives without the full political goal of total conquest. Scholars debate how formalized and consistent these were. We should not reduce all Mexica warfare to ritual sport, yet the concept matters because it shows something crucial. In this world, war could be structured as a means of feeding a cosmology, not merely expanding a border. Violence was not only strategic, it was metaphysical. Now, if you want to understand how sacrifice could be sustained without collapsing society into terror and rebellion, you have to understand the psychological engineering of honor. The Mexica did not present sacrifice to themselves as meaningless cruelty. They surrounded it with narratives that made certain deaths desirable, even enviable. Warriors who died in battle or on the sacrificial stone could be imagined as companions of the sun, helping it rise, returning as hummingbirds, butterflies, luminous beings feeding on flowers in paradise. Women who died in childbirth could be imagined as fierce spiritual forces accompanying the sun in its afternoon descent. These are not cute beliefs, they are social technologies that transform fear into duty and death into prestige. And then there is the rite that reveals the system's deepest intimacy, the one your original script already touched, and which deserves to be understood with full gravity: Toxcatl and the Exiptla of Tezcatlipoca. Tezcatlipoca is not the simple evil god that Spanish authors like to call him. He is the smoking mirror, the force of destiny, conflict, night, temptation, power, and the unpredictable turns that make rulers tremble. In Toxcatl, a man, often a captive, could be chosen to embody the god for an extended period. He was selected carefully, trained, dressed in finery, taught music and elite manners, and paraded through the city as a living presence. People greeted him not as a condemned man, but as Tezcatlipoca walking. They offered him flowers. They watched him as proof that the covenant still held. Then, when the appointed day arrived, he climbed the temple steps and broke his flutes one by one, snapping pleasure into silence. This detail matters because it is not gore, it is meaning. The breaking of the flutes is the shattering of earthly beauty at the edge of death. It teaches the city that all splendor is temporary, that even the god's presence in human form is borrowed. The ritual makes impermanence visible. When the sacrifice occurred, the act did not simply kill a victim, it returned the embodied deity to the divine realm. It also reaffirmed hierarchy. The city could treat a captive like a god, then consume him, then replace him, and the cycle itself became proof of the state's capacity to manage the boundary between human and divine. This is why sacrifice is never only religion and never only politics. It is where religion and politics become indistinguishable. And in the middle of this, the common household was not outside the system. This is another point colonial caricature obscures. Blood offerings were not reserved for the summit of pyramids. Auto-sacrifice, voluntary bloodletting, was widespread. People punctured ears, tongues, thighs, sometimes genitals, offering drops to household altars, feeding the gods in small daily payments. For priests and some devotees, this could be severe. Thorny cords pulled through flesh, night vigils, fasting, self-discipline that made the body a site of devotion. Without this, you misunderstand sacrifice entirely. The Mexica did not outsource all spiritual costs to others. They lived in a world where the sacred demanded bodily participation from everyone, though not at the same intensity, not in the same form. And yet, for all this cosmic framing, we cannot pretend the system was morally weightless. A coherent theology can still produce cruelty. A metaphysical necessity can still be weaponized by a state. The Mexica Empire benefited materially and psychologically from the spectacle of sacrifice. Fear and awe can stabilize a rule. Public ritual can intimidate enemies and discipline subjects. Captives displayed and killed in the imperial center are a message written in flesh. Resistance has consequences, and the gods are on the side of the state. This is why the Spanish arrived and immediately recognized sacrifice as both horror and opportunity. They were not innocent observers. They were men shaped by their own world's rituals of sanctioned violence. Spain had public executions, torture as a procedure, burnings justified as salvation, and holy wars framed as moral cleansing. The Inquisition was not a rumor, it was an institution. So when they saw the Mexica ritual killing, they did not meet violence for the first time. They met a rival theology of violence, one that did not place their God at the center. And that, more than blood itself, was the actual offense. So they translated it into their own categories: idols, devils, abominations. They wrote of priests as demonic butchers. They amplified numbers into impossibility. They stitched cannibalism into every scene because cannibalism is the fastest way to deny a people their humanity in the European imagination. They circulated engravings in Europe of grotesque temples and endless slaughter, often drawn by artists who had never seen the Americas, because horror sells and horror convinces. And once the public believes that people are monsters, conquest becomes a kind of mercy. Even within Spanish sources, you can see the strategy at work. Cortés could describe sacrifice as a reason the crown must intervene, then later claim that after he took control, sacrifice stopped altogether, as if to prove that conquest was not only justified but effective. The narrative becomes self-sealing. If you don't see sacrifice later, it's because we stopped it. If you do see it, it's because they are incorrigible and need harsher control. Either way, the empire wins. And then there is the living contradiction that he pointed toward with quiet force. The conquerors condemned indigenous violence while unleashing their own. When Cortés and his men entered Tenochtitlan, they were not merely walking into a city, they were walking into a ritual calendar. Festivals would still happen, processions would still move, drums would still speak, and this is where the collision becomes deadly, revealing everything about imperial misunderstanding. During the festival of Toxcatl in 1520, while Cortés was absent dealing with other Spaniards on the coast, Pedro de Alvarado ordered a massacre of unarmed celebrants in the sacred precinct, killing nobles and dancers in the middle of the ritual. This act was justified by fear and suspicion that the festival masked an uprising, but in the eyes of the Mexica, it was sacrilege and political betrayal at once. The city erupted, violence spiraled. Moctezuma II, whether still revered or already losing authority, was caught in the grinding gears of two incompatible worlds. The Spaniards tried to use him as a puppet and shield. The Mexica saw the sacred order collapsing. When Moctezuma died, killed by stones thrown by his own people in some Spanish accounts, killed by Spaniards in others, and in truth obscured by the fog of propaganda, his death became a symbol of an empire's spiritual crisis. Tlatoani, mediator of cosmic order, died while foreigners occupied the temple precinct. The world had tilted. And then came 1521, the siege, famine, smallpox, the breaking of causeways, the starving city surrounded, the canals choked, the chinampas turned into battlegrounds, water contaminated, bodies everywhere, violence on a scale that makes the moral lecture of conquistadors sound like ash in the mouth. The fall of Tenochtitlan was not a surgical removal of barbarity, it was an apocalypse. If you want to understand why sacrifice mattered, imagine what the Mexica must have felt as they watched their world end anyway. The gods demanded payment to keep the sun moving, and yet the world still burned. Was the debt unpaid? Were the gods abandoning them? Or had the cosmic order itself been captured by a foreign force with foreign rituals of violence? This is the kind of question the surviving sources rarely let us hear in an indigenous voice, because conquest silenced the ritual specialists who might have answered it on their own terms. Yet the survival of Nahua communities, languages, and ritual logics into the present, tells us that the Mexica world was not extinguished. It was forced to translate itself, to hide inside saints' days, to survive in maize ceremonies, in offerings, in prayers that still speak of reciprocity with the earth. So what do we do now with the image of the knife? We do something more difficult than condemnation or apology. We refuse the cheap comfort of calling an entire civilization savage because it practiced a form of violence we reject. We also refuse the dishonest comfort of pretending the violence never happened. We do what history demands. We understand. We understand that sacrifice was not an isolated act of brutality floating outside reason. It was a ritual system anchored in cosmology, sustained by state power, and embedded in an agricultural civilization that lived by cycles and feared collapse. We understand that the heart was not treated as disposable meat, but as sacred essence, returned to the forces that made life possible. We know that the ascent of temples was not merely a convenient stage for spectacle, but a symbolic movement between worlds. We understand that war was not simply conquest, but a structured method of acquiring captives, and that captive taking shaped the ethics of courage and status. We know that the priesthood was not a gang of fanatics, but an institution of trained specialists who managed time, song, blood, and fire. We understand that Spanish descriptions are both evidence and propaganda, and that the colonial archive is not neutral, it is a conquered space. And once we understand, the final illusion dissolves. The illusion that Western modernity stands outside ritual violence. Because if you look honestly, you find that every empire sanctifies its own forms of killing. Some call it sacrifice, some call it justice, some call it conversion, some call it civilization. The label changes, but the structure, the blending of morality, authority, and violence returns again and again. The Mexica were not uniquely human in their capacity for sacred bloodshed. They were uniquely visible because the conquerors needed them to be. So when you return to that first scene, Spaniards climbing the Templo Mayor, you can finally see the real drama. They did not just climb steps, they climbed into a different metaphysics. They reached the summit and misunderstood the world, believing they could conquer it. They saw blood and declared it proof of savagery, while carrying their own sanctioned violence like a cross and a sword. They called the gods demons, because acknowledging another coherent theology would threaten the moral armor of conquest. They called sacrifice madness, because admitting its internal logic would require acknowledging that violence is not a racial defect, it is a human institution that civilizations build, justify, and inherit. And here is the last thing I want you to hold. Not as a defense, not as an excuse, but as a historical truth with weight. The Mexica did not die with their temples. Their descendants did not vanish into myth. Nahua language lives. Indigenous communities across Mexico still negotiate the sacred with offerings, with reciprocity, with ceremony that binds time to the earth. The colonial story wanted a clean ending, a monster slain, a world replaced. History does not grant that simplicity. Continuity survives in the cracks. So the question is no longer only what happened on those steps in 1519. The question is who has been telling you what it meant ever since, and what they needed you to believe about Latin America to believe it. Muchas gracias. Thanks for trekking the hidden trails of Latin America with me. If tonight's story unsettled you, subscribe and ring the bell, because Latin America's darkest stories are far from over.